So, welcome to 22nd Century Management with Ken. If you're new to the podcast, every week at 2 o'clock on Tuesdays, and that's Eastern Time, I'm here live with a fascinating guest. Today I have with me Joel Schwartzberg. And Joel is a leadership communications coach whose clients include American Express, Blue Cross, Blue Shield, State Farm Insurance, the Brennan Center for Justice, and Comedy Central. So, Joel, tell us a little more about who you are and what you do.
Sure. Thanks, Ken. I wish I could be on the beach like you are. A little jealous in the off season. I'm happy to be here. I've been teaching public speaking skills for a little over 16 years now. And that comes from my experience as a competitive public speaker, actually in middle school and high school and college. And basically took all the things I learned from competition and I put them into a business context. You're interviewing for a job, you're getting a performance review, you're communicating up, you're communicating down, you're going to conferences. And an interesting thing happened about 3 years into my public speaking training, which was I was training people to be convincing speakers. They were gesturing well, they were using volume, they were pausing, they were positioning themselves right. But when I asked them for their point, what point are you trying to make? They would give me things that were not a point. And Ken, this is fatal because without a point, you are rendered pointless. So I really turned the nature of my training to what is a point? How do you know if you have one or not? And then how to champion and sharpen that point. And that culminated in a book I wrote in 2017 called Get to the Point, which is kind of a short manual that has some of the exercises and tactics that I talk about. In the meantime, I've actually take a day job at a major United States nonprofit where I oversee executive communications. The beauty of that is I get to try out things in the real space with CEOs and leaders, see what's effective, what's not effective. And that culminated in a book I wrote this year called The Language of Leadership, which is about applying those techniques toward leaders, what they can do to do two big things: engage and inspire. To me, those are the two things that I think leaders need to do. And that brings us here today.
Okay, well, very nice. And it's really interesting because you're talking about what is the point. And I've sat in auditoriums and listened to speakers drone on for an hour. Mm-hmm. And you walk out and say, what did he say and why?
Right.
Because he didn't get to the point. And it reminded me, and I'm dating myself, but I am an old man. There was an album by a guy named Harry Nilsson. Mm-hmm. And the title of the album was The Point. And in that album, there was a song called The Point. And in that song, he said, a point in every direction is the same as no point at all.
Right.
And I love that line because...
Yeah, that's a good one. I'm going to write that down.
Actually, I liked it. It was kind of a quirky little album, but there was a video that went with it. It was pretty interesting.
Yeah. This is what, when I talk about a point and I say people don't know what their point is, they're substituting something else for that point. It's not just there's a vacuum there, but they confuse a point for a topic, a theme, a category, a catchphrase, lots of things that aren't points. They're just words and thoughts. A point is a proposal, a one-directional, if we can borrow from Nilsson there, one-directional, one idea that you want your audience to take away, not something you're just throwing out there.
Yeah, and I love that because I like the fact that you need to have one idea. Mm-hmm. If you have more than one idea, then you may have two presentations.
Right. And you're not considering your audience because your audience needs about 3 times more time to receive your point than you need to say it. Think of yourself as a speaker. You know it. You've been thinking about it. You prepared it. You're an expert in it. Now think of your audience. They need to hear it, listen to it. Is this relevant? Does this make sense? How can I apply this to my work? Should I tweet this? Should I write it down? Meanwhile, you're 6 sentences down the road. So that's why it's so important to be slow, to have one idea at a time, which you just said, Ken, and just to be very clear.
Yeah. And for anybody that thinks that you sometimes don't communicate, think about the conversations you have with your mate and how many times you think you said something that any moron could understand. And they're like, what?
Yeah. Right. And the complication is that a lot of public speakers, whether they're leaders or not, think my goal is not to screw up. My goal is to come across as knowledgeable and smart and interesting and memorable and charismatic. Well, you know what, Ken? Those are the things you want to impress people with if your objective is to get more public speaking gigs. But the truth of the matter is, you don't want people to remember you as a great speaker. What good does that do you? Because you had a point to make. You want people to receive the point you're making. That's why we say we deliver a speech. We don't perform a speech. If you are very memorable, but you didn't deliver that point, you have failed. But if you deliver your point, even if imperfectly, then you have succeeded.
Yeah, I love that. So I guess the question is what is it you do to make sure that you identify the point?
Right. I wanted a very easy exercise that people could use to really have a green light, red light situation, a litmus test. I plop in what I think is my point on one end, I get a green light or red light on the other end. And it's called the I believe that test. It's very simple. Even students can use it. And it goes like this. You take what you think is your point. Usually it should be one sentence. The point you want the people in your audience, your team, your employees to take away. And you put the words I believe that in front of it. And you ask only one real question. Is this now a complete sentence? If it is, something that would impress your fifth grade language arts teacher as a complete sentence, not a fragment or a run-on. If it is, you're on your way to making a strong and smart and sharp point. If it is not a complete sentence, you need to reimagine it. So let me give you an example. Let's say podcasting. I believe that podcasting is not a complete sentence. So podcasting is not your point. I believe that the importance of podcasting, still not a complete sentence. So the importance of podcasting is not a point. You're not saying what's important about it. So it forces you to come up with something like, I believe that podcasting is the most effective way for us to reach our millennial audience. Complete sentence, and it is a point. Makes people think, go on. I want to hear more about that. Please prove to me how I can reach my millennial audience through the vehicle of podcasting.
Well, you know what? That's really interesting because I just came back from an event and I gave a speech there. And I am not sure that I had the point as clearly outlined as I wanted. And I think that maybe the audience didn't walk away, with as much information as they could have. They walked away with a lot of information. And I think that I drove part of the point home, but I think that if I had gone through that exercise, that speech would have been better.
Right. And we need to move away from this idea that information inspires. Information educates, information is useful, but it's only the point that inspires. So to get from information, what I sometimes call a book report or a Wikipedia page, blast them with information, you need to collapse that down, maybe use the I believe that test or any means really, work with your colleagues to understand what do I want them to take away? Not the information, but the relevance of the information. How does the information serve my goals, enable me to do my job more effectively, enable us to reach our fourth quarter revenue goal more successfully? That's the key question.
Okay. Well, very good. So now let's say that I've identified my point and I'm going to be in a virtual meeting presenting this. What do I need to do to be effective in that meeting? Because, obviously there's a difference between a virtual meeting, an in-person presentation in front of a large audience, and a conversation with a colleague. So how do I make it effective for the virtual meeting?
Right. So when we moved from rooms to Zooms, we took some things for granted that we shouldn't have. Sometimes it's something called Zoom fatigue, and I hate to use isms, but this one actually has some gravity to it because our bodies are at home. We often say we're in our pajama pants. We have our cats and our kids and our drinks and our sandwiches around us. So we relax a little bit. Maybe we aren't as loud. We aren't as articulate. Sometimes we don't feel like we need to make a point. We could just, hey, it's a conversation. So we need to remember that our head is at work, even if our body isn't. And so I often talk about making sure your presence is supporting your point. So the first thing is about framing. A lot of people are way back here or they're under here. They don't check themselves. As in any sort of conversation, you want to get a full sense of the presenter. So make sure your head and shoulders, this is the tip, are clear and in view. Make sure your background is not distracting. If there are things that, if your environment does not support your point, it is stealing from your point. So make sure it is neutral, or at least says things like, I read books, I'm studious, or I'm neat. And then one big thing, Ken, I want to leave your audience with is the rules of eye contact change completely on Zoom. So I'm looking at you right now, but you see me looking off eye contact because I'm looking at the Brady Bunch. Now, here is my camera. This is where eye contact happens. Now, it's very hard to look into this cold black dot for the entirety of a conversation or a meeting. But I know when I'm making my point, this is how we're going to save lives. This is how we're going to sell more Coca-Cola. That I want to maximize my eye contact for. So that's when I'll look away from the Brady Bunch screen and look into my camera. And for that reason, you should keep your notes, your PowerPoint, everything as close to the camera as possible. Because here's my rule of thumb. When you look between your notes and your camera, you should be only moving your eyes, not your head or your neck. If you can move between your notes and your camera without moving your head or your neck, they're close enough. But if you're watching a tennis match, they're too far apart.
And it's interesting in a presentation, in fact, the speech class we were talking about before, one of the things that they said that I liked is they said that the ideal situation when you're presenting to an audience and you want to maintain good contact is actually get a little mini tripod, mount your webcam to it, and put it, if you're giving a speech, for example, you put it where your notes surround it.
Exactly.
So that when you're looking at it, you're looking at it. Now, in this case, I look at you, and again, my eyes are not quite on the camera.
Right.
I look to my camera, I look to my notes. I don't have to move my head at all to do that.
Right. It's all
I actually moved my camera. Yeah.
Right. And often, when I work with CEOs, we often think, well, I have to look at my audience. I have to know how they're responding. Not so true in Zoom, because you can see things that may give you the wrong idea. If someone turns their head, it may not be because they're bored. It may be because someone's ringing the doorbell. So you can't rely on it. So what I'd say is, because you want to keep eye contact as good as possible, put your notes or your PowerPoint, don't be afraid to cover the Zoom screen and the audience so that you're only looking at your notes and your camera, because they won't know the difference. You have the eye contact, and you really don't need to be looking at people. If you have conversation and back and forth and chat, that's one thing. But if you're presenting a speech or an idea, then you don't really need to be looking at the people on the Brady Bunch grid.
Yeah, I agree 100% with that. In fact, recently I gave a presentation on Zoom. And the key to that then becomes to know your presentation where you can talk about it pretty much looking at the camera.
Right.
It's not, and I'm as anti-manuscript discussion or read a PowerPoint to people as you can get.
Right.
It is just remember your main points, and then your outline can just be the main points.
Right.
It doesn't have to be the conversation or every word you're saying.
Sometimes I put sticky notes around my camera because I totally agree with it. I've written about most people 99% of the time should never write a word for word speech, no matter what the occasion, unless you have a teleprompter or you're giving a huge speech as a CEO, because reading and speaking are two separate functions in the brain, and the audience receives them differently. But yeah, I like to keep notes, not here on my second screen, which a lot of people have and a lot of people do, but here, right as close to the camera as possible.
I think that's a great idea. And it's interesting because I have delivered manuscript speeches where I needed to be word for word in front of a large audience. But at the same time, you can maintain audience contact by, again, knowing what you're going to say. And even though you're reading it, you can remember enough of a sentence that you can look up and look at your audience during that process.
Yeah.
So even if in front of 5,000 people.
Yeah, as a speechwriter, I have a little trick. Sometimes I do write a full speech for a CEO, and then I'll bullet it out so that even though the words are there, although I'm cutting words as much as possible, they're in bullets. This enables the speaker to moving from one bullet to the other and sort of transition a thought. Sometimes I say it's read or riff. You can read that or you can riff on it. And then you just move to the next bullet. So they see it as a series of decisions versus a full script that they could lose their place in, that they could stumble over something. They can get bored with their own script, all those problems that may occur.
Okay, so let me ask you a different question, because part of being effective as a communicator is listening effectively. So, what are some of the things that you suggest about how do we learn to listen effectively?
Right. So, yeah, and I talk about listening in the language of leadership because your audience, your people, your staff, your employees, they want to know you care. And how do they know you care? Not by saying, I care. They'll know you care mostly because you listen. Now, how do you listen effectively? Well, some of the tips are obvious. Don't multitask. Don't listen thinking, what am I going to say next? No, really, really listen. Turn off your email. Make sure you have attention. Give eye contact. Now, two things that we don't hear that often. One is to nod. Nodding is a very powerful listening reaction because when you applaud, that says, okay, I see that you're done. When you smile, you're saying, all right, you entertained or amused me. But when you nod, you're saying, I'm buying what you're selling. I've heard your point, I've received your point, and it's making sense to me. It's one of the most uh, versatile and substantial things you can communicate back to someone. And then the second tip is about mirroring. You mentioned when you have a partner. This comes from the partner world often, where you reflect something back to someone. So they say, I want to know what we're doing about our fourth quarter goals. And before you answer, you may say, all right, let me understand your question correctly. You want to understand if we're putting enough money into R&D versus into the bank. Is that correct? And then the other person says, yes, that is correct. Or they say, no, not really. I just really want to know what we're going to be doing in R&D. But the impact of your saying, let me get this straight. Let me repeat it back to you. Am I correct? Has enormous impact in demonstrating to the other person that you're paying attention, you care about getting it right, and you care about giving an answer that makes sense to them.
That's really interesting because in the service management class I teach, I talk to my managers about when they're dealing with unhappy customers and when they're dealing with their technicians about active listening.
Mhm.
And the repeat back is a piece of that. The other thing is I would tell a customer or a technician, while we talk, I'm going to make some notes so I make sure I don't forget anything.
Right.
And then, like you said, the mirroring, repeating it back, reflecting back. And then there's another piece that I love of this is, and what else?
Mhm.
I love that as a question because especially if you got an irate customer, you just keep letting them vent. You don't try to
Right.
interrupt. You don't defend yourself. You just pull information and make notes.
Right. And if you can't answer them right away in that moment, there's another thing they're looking for that's very valuable, and that is acknowledgement. And that's as simple as I hear what you're saying. When I have conflict with someone, but we're not reaching solution right away, I will say, I hear you. I acknowledge what you're saying. I acknowledge this is a challenge for us. And so let's work together to get to the bottom of it. See how there's no solution there yet? There's not me being the fixer as the leader, but it's still very powerful. My saying, I hear you. Let's work together on a solution.
I love that. I think that's a huge thing. So let's talk about telling stories and sharing case studies effectively. We talked a little beforehand, and I'm a huge fan of stories. I think they're way underused, and they're sometimes they're improperly used as well. So what can you share about telling stories and making them effective?
I agree. The first thing to know, really, sometimes I talk about storytelling to CEOs and leaders, and they say, "Well, my life has been really boring. I'm not going to write a memoir. I don't really have stories." But the story doesn't need to be brilliant to that there needs to be a movie made of it. It could be something you heard from your child. It could be something you remember from your own childhood. It could be something you heard on NPR that morning. So let's bring down the level of a story needs to be uh, breathtaking and cinematic to be interesting. Sometimes it's just a notion. But here's the thing I most often say about storytelling, and the biggest problem I see. We know now that storytelling is amazing in terms of its impact. You can go to conferences about stories, you could buy entire books about storytelling. But here's the mistake I see people saying: they share the story, but they don't share the relevance. And when I say relevance, I mean key words like this. This story shows why we must. This story illustrates why we should. This case study proves that if we do X, we can expect Y. That's, to me, the most important part of the story, not the story itself, but when we use the words to explain the point of the story. The story is, at the end of the day, a vehicle through which your point travels, not just an icebreaker. Because a story on its own may be riveting, but it takes a little more to be relevant.
I love that. I think that stories, and the other place that we can get stories from, and I think this kind of applies in maybe in the customer relations, brand building piece of it, is tell stories of your customers and
Right.
things. I had a customer that was struggling with a situation like a lot of you may be.
Right.
And this is what they were fighting. And this is, and by the way, when we started working with them, we were able to do this.
Right.
That
And
kind of,
here's how it applies, how I see it applying to you.
yeah,
Exactly.
yeah, tie it in. So that was a little weak, but I think that especially customer stories have power because it's not again, you've made it not about you. Too many times people, when they tell stories, it's all about them.
Right.
And that's not necessarily a good piece of it.
Right. As
Okay,
if
so
they're checking a box called transparency, or they're thinking, oh, I want you to relate to me as a human, which, by the way, is important.
yeah,
But don't waste that opportunity to support your point through that story.
right. Okay, and I'd agree with that. So how do you communicate authentically as a leader?
Sure. And this is key. Let's first say why that's important. Let's remember we're all humans. How do humans relate to each other? Not because we come across like a robot or like a press release, but as a human being. And that's about authenticity. And by the way, authenticity builds trust. That's why authenticity, it's not important for its own sake. It's important in terms of the impact it has. So one of the ways I talk about communicating authentically is by its very nature, don't ever say anything you wouldn't say. You may have speechwriters. You might be emulating the words of someone you think is a great public speaker. Let's say Michelle Obama or Ronald Reagan or a business leader. If you emulate their words, you are not being authentic because people want to hear your words. So don't let your speechwriters or your teams write for you anything you wouldn't ordinarily say. Number two is skip the script. We talked for a moment about it, but when you read to your audience, you are creating distance between you and them for the most part. And also, very few people, except for trained actors or people who've been doing it for a living, can actually emote while they're reading versus as they're speaking. Your audience, your team, your employees, they want you to be a live human being. Just make your point to them because you know it. You've proved it in your head. And so you need to tell them something they don't know that you know. And that's one of the easiest way to sort of break it down. Make it sound like you, and then tell stories, if you can, about your experience. They don't need to be cinematic, something that you saw even, that you witnessed. Maybe it didn't happen to you. And then the final rule about authenticity is remember that the goal is never precision. It is not a public speaking or communication contest. It is not a CEO contest. You're not going to get a trophy at the end of the day for perfection. And sometimes imperfection, pausing, changing a word, thinking aloud, reinforces your humanness. And when you reinforce your humanity, that creates authenticity. And as we said, true authenticity leads to trust.
That's really interesting because I'm gonna go to my other my part-time job, I guess we'll call it, or my avocation. But I watch a lot of YouTube videos by a lot of content creators. And the ones that I like best are not the ones that are all polished. Sometimes I get so tired. I remember recently I watched a video where they were walking down a hallway and the camera went in a circle and they did all of this stuff.
Right, Scorsese.
And it went on forever, and it was, visually very interesting, I guess. But I was like, stop, I can't deal with this. That's
Right.
not what I want. I want real people in real situations, sharing something that's valuable, that's useful.
Right. And there's a real world application there. I work with a CEO, and sometimes my media team says, oh, let's put some music behind it, or let's put some great B-roll through it. And we have to realize that the more production we put against it, the more it seems like a commercial, not a presentation, that it doesn't seem like an authentic, what's the most authentic version of a video? A selfie. Now, I'm not saying that CEOs need to do selfies with their phones, but it needs to come close to that so that it seems real. It seems like, here's an idea I want to share with you, not create a commercial to convince you.
Well, it's really interesting because one of the people I follow actually a couple of people I follow on LinkedIn are really big about selfie videos. It's one gentleman, and he may be listening, Earl Everson, but he picks up his camera and he goes live on LinkedIn and he talks about stuff.
Yeah.
No script, it's no production quality to it. He's just live on LinkedIn talking about it. I don't know if you know Rick Lambert, but he teaches communication. And one of the things he's talking to salespeople about is building your brand. He says, just go live, take a selfie, get up and do a selfie video, talk to the people in your audience, the people you care about reaching, and just talk to them.
Right. This is why TED Talks are so impactful and so successful, because it is a very minimalist set. Yeah, sometimes you have a beautiful PowerPoint, but really the focus is one person sharing ideas in a way that at least seems like they're coming up with them on the spot. And that is much better than, imagine TED as a bunch of super produced video commercials. It would not succeed because we get that from television. What we want to see is people making effective points that can enable us to, we use the word impact, but let's break that down. What is impact when you give a presentation? You want people to think differently, to think anew, or to take an action as a result of your communication. And the best presentations do that through simplicity, not through production.
Yeah. I think that is so true. And just one thing I'll throw out my biggest pet peeve.
Please.
I absolutely hate people that read PowerPoints. We had an instructor in a company I worked for, and we said that his students died death by PowerPoint.
Right.
And and he give us a handout, and then he'd read every word on the handout to us.
Right.
And give us a test. He'd read every question and every answer. He put a PowerPoint up. He read his slides basically word for word.
Right.
And I was about 10 minutes into the class. One of my coworkers was sitting next to me. I passed him in a note, said, "Kill me now, please."
Right. Because again, the audience doesn't want to be read to. And by the way, so what can we, I don't believe that PowerPoints are awful inherently. For one thing, I'm a visual learner. So actually when I see it, it reinforces what the speaker is saying to me audibly. So it actually helps me. But how do we create PowerPoints to help avoid that reading? Well, look at the words on the PowerPoint. The fewer words, the more likely you're going to not read them. Never use complete sentences. If you need to put in a period, it's a complete sentence. So write it in such a way that it forces those words to trigger you, not script you, so that you can't read a PowerPoint slide. There's only a few words there. You actually have to let that prompt you and then turn back to your audience and make your point.
And that's exactly what I do. My PowerPoints are my outline.
Right, exactly.
It would be the best way to describe them. They are not, and it's interesting that if you practice your what you're talking about, and if you're passionate about it and you believe in it, what I find myself a lot of times doing is I'll be 3 or 4 bullets ahead of my PowerPoint. Yeah. Every once in a while, I'll stop and click. Okay, let me catch it up here. Because I know what I'm talking about. I believe in it. It's like I taught class this morning, and we were talking about ways that they could build additional revenue in the service department. And I went on for about 30 minutes, and I realized I hadn't clicked my PowerPoint presentation. It was a Zoom meeting, but I hadn't moved my PowerPoint presentation at all. I hadn't brought up any of the bullet points. So then I had to click and catch up. But it's those things that matter to you, that you understand and are the things that you should be speaking about, because if you have to read it, you don't know it well enough, I think, to to be up there in front of people presenting.
Yeah. And when it's a virtual meeting, I encourage people to use speaker mode. So the speaker is there full size, at least right next to the PowerPoint. Because remember, the speaker is Batman. The PowerPoint is Robin, or maybe actually even the butler, even less than Robin. Yeah. So remember, it's coming from you. The visuals are just reinforcing the points you're making yourself.
Yeah, I agree so much. Joel, it has been a lot of fun. We've used up a half hour here. So I do think it's probably time we should say goodbye to the audience. But you did give me the name of your book again.
Sure. The first book is called Get to the Point, and the second book is called The Language of Leadership: How to Engage and Inspire Your Team.
Okay. And so what everybody will find, whether you're watching this on YouTube on the replay, or you're watching it live today, or if you're watching it on LinkedIn or on the replay, is very shortly in the notes, I will have all of Joel's contact information and a link to his book so that you can find it. I would encourage everybody to be back next week. I've got another topic that I forgot. I should have brought up a slide and I didn't, but that's all right. I have another great speaker that will be here. It'll be a lot of fun. I invite everybody back, and do me a favor. If you're watching on LinkedIn and you haven't followed 22nd Century Management, please do so. Trying to get some status built up with LinkedIn so I can do a few more things that I can't right now. If you're watching on YouTube, obviously I'd love subscriptions. And if you hit like, it lets YouTube know they can share it with somebody else. And we'll see everybody next week.
Thank you, Ken, and thanks to your audience.